Hi, I'm Helena.
And I'm Debs. We both work at the MS Trust, a charity for people affected by MS. Just a little disclaimer, this podcast was recorded over Zoom, so please do bear with us if the sound is a little iffy at any stage during this recording.
I'd like to welcome you all to the MS Trust podcast, Multiple Sclerosis Breaking It Down. And this time we are talking about thinking problems in MS. Problems with thinking and memory affect about half people with MS. Cognition is the medical term for thinking, and problems with thought and memory are known as cognitive problems. I was already stumbling on my words. Issues can include memory, attention span, planning, decision-making, and understanding or concentration.
To try to explain a bit about what cognition issues in MS are, and to hear about some techniques that may help, we chatted with Professor Roshan das Nair. We'll be listening to that interview a little bit later. But for now, we're going to talk about lived experience of cognition. And this week, Helena, who usually asks the questions, is going to be in the hot seat, sharing with us some of the ways that her MS affects her own cognition. So, Helena, can you take us back to when you first became aware of cognition issues?
Yes. So when I was first diagnosed with MS in 2007, my symptoms were mostly sensory and fatigue. But I didn't really know of the fatigue connection with MS. To be fair, I started Googling and I ended up on the MS Trust website. And I sort of started reading about all these different MS symptoms. And I just went into the A to Z, sort of started going through it. And then when I ended up on the letter C, I read cognition. And I just remember getting one of those aha moments like, oh, so that's why. Because when I was little, I was a total bookworm. You would find me with a book everywhere. Like my parents would take me to a restaurant and I would just sit and ignore them. I would sit and read. I mean, I suppose that's what kids do these days with tablets and telephones, but I was sitting there with my like, I don't know, Nancy Drew books or what have you. And I could just, it didn't matter how noisy it was, anything, any kind of settings, and I would be able to concentrate. And then when I sort of started having some of these issues that later on turned out to be MS symptoms and relapses and whatnot, I would still be commuting into London every day and I would sit there with my book and I would read. And then I would be like, what? I've read the same page about 50 times. I just could not take it in. And I just kind of thought, well, maybe I'm just being tired. I don't know. But it used to bug me because I was like, I could do this and now I can't anymore.
So did you have any other issues apart from that going on at that time?
Yeah, so my husband, he would always complain because I used to be at university, I used to study film. So I used to sit and watch film all the time. I could concentrate through, the trickiest of Russian dramas and all kinds of things. But I would sit and watch TV with my husband and I would just like be fidgeting with my phone or I would be doing other things. And he would be like, oh, you're such a child of the MTV generation. I don't even know if people use that terminology anymore. But
probably not, but yeah, I know what you mean.
You get used to those kind of ever-changing music videos. So you if anything would get a little bit boring, I would just like start drifting off. So I guess that's also sort of to do with concentration and retaining information. But then around the same time, I started sort of losing words more and more. And because I'm Swedish, I kind of just put it down to that. I kind of thought, well, my brain is trying to think in two languages, and that's why it goes a little bit funny. But then the husband would say like, well, say it in Swedish then, because he's English, but he could understand some Swedish. Yeah. And then the Swedish word would be just as much gone. So I was like, oh, I'm failing in two languages now.
That's a good point, actually. Yes, I hadn't crossed my mind whether, does it affect you in both languages in the same way, equally? Yeah. Wow.
So one of my friends, she described this. I think this was, she doesn't have MS, but she's perimenopausal, but she would say like, she feels like she could see the word in front of her, but it's like, like you're taking your glasses off and it's just a little bit blurry. So she's like, I can nearly reach out and grab it and see what it is, but it's just like, the cog fog is in the way. You can't clear it. So it can be very sort of frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you deal with that then?
Well, I have a few strategies that have sort of developed over the years. I think I used to get very frustrated with somebody trying to find words for me, because sometimes when they fire off lots of words and you'd be like, no, it's not that. So I try to describe the word instead. So for instance, if I say that apple is the word that I don't remember, I would be like, it's the green fruit, the crunchy one. And then hopefully we will sort of end up finding that word towards the end. But sometimes you do land on a few different things beforehand. There are a few green fruits, aren't there? When it comes to concentration, so at work, that was actually one of the things that I had to request to change, because when I first joined the MS Trust, I sat really close to where the office manager sat, so where the people were used to answering phones. So the phones would ring all the time. And I would sit there and I would work and I would completely lose my concentration, because not that I necessarily needed to eavesdrop on the telephone call, but it was just like, it threw me off because I just suddenly heard another conversation and I just couldn't deal with what I was doing. So I had to actually go and ask my manager and sort of say, could I please be moved somewhere where it's a bit more quiet, because it's hard work to do this. And I felt it took me a long time to actually request it, because I felt like, I don't want to be a bother. And you sort of come, I don't know, you grow up with wanting to be good at these things. And like concentration was always something I was good at. You know, I was good at school, things like that. Yeah. And so it was hard. But, being an MS organization, they were like, well, obviously we know about these things. So it wasn't a problem to be moved.
Yeah.
But I sometimes also put like things like headphones on, even if I'm not listening to anything, because it kind of clears the noise. I always said I should have one of those, the headgear that they have in a Handmaid's Tale, visors, so it's always like blinkers on, so you can't see anyone.
Yeah, I can relate to that myself. Yeah, absolutely.
One thing that I found has really changed for me was like, since we started doing home working as well, because I can really concentrate much more at home. I know some people say that things can be distracting, you have your children around or things, but since I sort of moved myself into my bedroom, I'm sitting here, I can focus really well.
I would agree with that too, definitely. I think the lockdown and working from home has been in many ways an absolute godsend, really, because I would have the same experience as you in an office. Love working around people. I really do love being around people, providing the people are all getting on with their own stuff. But if people are having conversations, then I'm exactly the same. I can't help but drift into them. And then it's particularly hard if I'm trying to write something, if I'm trying to be creative and create a report or a written document or do something that isn't kind of processy, but it's more kind of creative, then I really struggle. On the converse side of that, or the flip side of that rather, if I'm doing something processy, I prefer to have background noise, because then I kind of focus in on the task, if that makes sense. If it's some data manipulation or, just something kind of spreadsheety, then I prefer to have noise around me. So it's different sort of settings I need for different types of tasks. But I do struggle with cognition, and I think but things that you've described are the same for me, like word finding and reading. When I read information, I sometimes have to read it more slowly than I used to do, or I have to read it several times. But I think the worst example of, I suppose it's quite a funny story for cognition for me, happened a couple of years ago when I was working in a previous role. I got into work one morning and the CEO was in the kitchen making a cup of tea, and I walked past her and I wanted to say hello to her. So I said hello, and her name was Suzanne, but I could not think of the name Suzanne. All I could think about was the word Lazy Susan, which, as you may know, is one of those trays that you use to put crisps and nuts and things in. So I was going to say hello, and I just kept thinking Lazy Susan, and I just could not get the Lazy Susan out of my head to find her name Suzanne. And in the end, I just said hello and just sort of stared at her, and she looked at me really strangely, as if like, this is kind of weird. So I went off anyway, and then I had to come back later on and explain to her what happened, because I was so embarrassed and I felt it was so obvious. I don't think she'd actually really even noticed what had happened, but I felt that it was really obvious that I'd not been able to say her name. And it made me feel quite uncomfortable. It was quite funny, because I think if I'd said Lazy Susan, that wouldn't have gone down too well with the CEO. But yeah.
Well, that's funny. No, I can be the same with names as well. There's certain names that sort of don't want to register with me, even if they're people that I see a lot of the time and the things, and I almost have to like see it in front of me. I always used to be very visual when it came to like remembering things from school books and stuff like that. So it's almost like I had to think, oh, hang on, I've seen that person. What does that person's Facebook profile looks like? And the name is underneath, and the name is Jess. And then it would be like Jess, even though I clearly do know that person's name, but it just seems to be again that cogfog just kind of clouds around it.
That's a good technique actually for putting names on people, because I think I have the same problem, and sometimes there are some people's names I just don't think suit them, or I for some reason I cannot assimilate that name with that person. So I'll forever call somebody. There's a guy that I go to the gym with, and or he's at the gym, and his name is Alan, but I always want to call the guy that's with him Barry Allen. I always get the two of them mixed up for some reason. And there's been so many occasions that I've spoken to Barry and called him Alan because for some reason he looks more like an Alan than a Barry. So I find that really difficult as well. So maybe your idea about with Facebook, yeah, is quite a good tip for that.
You just have to end up giving people lots of weird nicknames instead. I do remember having a HR manager many years ago, one of my first jobs, and I think she constantly kept on forgetting what people were called. And I remember one time she actually came in to make me redundant. She came in and went, "Hello, sausage," and I thought, "Oh, this is very professional." I don't know. Maybe not go down that route, but
maybe not.
Yeah. Now, before we listen to the interview with Roshan, we wanted to spread some holiday cheer. Because as you might know, or might not know, the MS Trust has got some lovely Christmas cards out. And if you want to be in time to actually order these ones for the big day, you can go onto our website and look for them. But because our last postal order date is the 19th of December. And you can also check out some other MS Trust merchandise if you need some gift inspiration. And you can order via our shop at shop.mstrust.org.uk/Christmas-cards.
Okay, great. For now, though, let's listen to Helena's chat with Roshan about cognition issues and MS.
So we're here to talk about cognition issues, and I have a guest with me who was in our cognition webinar that we did earlier this year. I'm going to hand over to you, Roshan. Can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Yeah, sure. My name is Roshan das Nair. I'm a senior research scientist based at SINTEF in Trondheim, Norway, and I'm a professor of clinical psychology and neuropsychology at the University of Nottingham in the UK.
And the first question really, I guess, is could you explain what cognition problems in MS are and why they might happen?
So cognitive problems refer to difficulties related to thinking. Now, these could include issues of memory, being able to pay attention or concentrate, and being able to do even more complicated tasks like problem solving. And about 40 to 60% of people with MS tend to experience these kind of cognitive problems. Now, cognition itself is quite a complex phenomenon. We haven't been able to precisely say why people experience cognitive problems or what specifically causes them, but the reasons could largely fall within 2 or 3 camps. Firstly, there is the direct cause of MS. So that's based on what's happening to the nerves in the brain, with those nerves becoming affected by the MS itself. Now, the other is more of an indirect cause caused by the effects of having MS. What I mean by this is, for instance, the effects of having the other symptoms of MS and the impact that has on your life, whether this is fatigue or mobility issues or pain, and how they can impact on your daily living, on your daily activities. This is an often neglected aspect of cognition, but it's really important. So, for instance, if someone's fatigue is not properly managed, they may withdraw from their usual activities. And these are activities that people may have found quite pleasurable. So, for example, they may stop going out with friends, or they may stop working. And these are mentally stimulating activities. And people who withdraw, as people withdraw, these opportunities for such mental stimulation also decreases. And this could cause a downward spiral leading to less mental stimulation, more withdrawal, feeling more upset, and so on. Now, another indirect way in which cognitive problems may be developed relates to how these symptoms are actually managed. There could be some side effects from some of the medications that may cause cognitive problems. For example, pain medications. We know that some pain medications do affect people's cognitive ability. So it's very important for people with MS to discuss their cognitive problems with their neurologist or their MS treating team to ensure that they can have a better understanding of what's kind of causing these cognitive problems and find solutions to enable people to deal with these cognitive problems.
Are there any treatments for cognitive problems?
Well, I'm not aware of any medical or drug treatments for cognitive problems, but cognitive rehabilitation has been found to be helpful. Now, cognitive rehabilitation itself is a structured set of therapeutic activities that's typically delivered by clinical psychologists or neuropsychologists or occupational therapists. They firstly help you to understand what cognitive difficulties you're facing, to enable the treating clinician to understand the strengths and difficulties of your cognitive profile, if you'd like. And then the second thing they do is to try and help you find ways of dealing with these problems to help you compensate for the difficulties that you're experiencing. So this could be in terms of making some adjustments to your surroundings or identifying specific tools or aids to help you cope with these cognitive problems. And increasingly, research is showing that this type of cognitive rehabilitation is effective in helping people to deal with their cognitive problems.
If you feel like you got some of these sort of issues, how's the best way to sort of get referred to actually speaking to someone like yourself?
Yeah, that's now quite complicated in the UK because we don't have a structured referral pathway. So what typically happens is that it varies from site to site. It varies from where you're based. But speaking to your neurologist often is a good starting point because they will be familiar with what services are available locally for you. There isn't a national service, a referral service for people with cognitive difficulties. In some centres, they do have access to clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists, and therefore your treating neurologist or MS-Nurse specialist might be able to refer you to that service. But in other places, it might be a little more challenging. But oftentimes there is some service that might be available for people with cognitive difficulties. So the first step is definitely speaking to your treating team.
We asked the MS community to send us in some questions that we thought we would ask you, if this is okay. And the first one, I think this is a topic I see come up quite a lot, because I guess when you have cognitive issues, people worry about other, problems with like dementia and things like that. So do we know if MS increases the risk of dementia?
I think I need to start by saying the cognitive difficulties that people with MS have is not equal to dementia. I want to make that absolutely clear, because you're absolutely right. People, when they experience cognitive difficulties, they get concerned and they think, is this dementia? So I want to be clear that, cognitive deficits seen in MS is different from having dementia. Having said that, there have been a few studies now that shows that there's a small increased risk of developing dementia among some people with MS. However, these studies haven't been conclusive about this risk, and therefore it's difficult to be certain about these findings. And again, researchers are not sure what causes this risk. It could be related to some of the secondary problems caused by MS, as I've mentioned before, for example, more withdrawal and less mental stimulation. But it's still not very clear. There is some small risk, but apart from that, it's not very clear what that risk is.
And here's another question. My teenager has MS and is really forgetful. What can I do about this? Or is there any strategies that they could try?
Yeah, I mean, they could firstly try and identify what aspects of their life are most affected by forgetfulness. Are there some things that they forget more than others? And what are the specific things that they forget? Because oftentimes it's not uniform. People don't forget everything. There may be specific things that people forget about. Next is to try and break down those tasks that they forget and to identify whether there are some issues in how they're making sense of what needs to be remembered that's causing the problem. For instance, for some people with memory problems, it's because they have difficulties in paying attention to what is being said, for example. Therefore, they have not understood the information in the first place. So when they try and retrieve it or they try and recall it, there's nothing there to retrieve. For others, it could be because they haven't processed the information properly. They haven't understood the information or absorbed it well enough for it to be recalled. The other thing to try is definitely what we try using external memory aids. Now, these include things like notes or post-its or reminders on your phone or a calendar and so on. Now, some people are very worried about using these aids because they think it might actually make their memory worse, but there is no evidence to show that it makes people's memories worse. What it does do is it enables people to get on with their life, and I think that's what we need to be enabling people to do.
That's it sounds like the sort of advice, especially when you're a teenager and there's so much things going on in your life anyway with school and things, that to actually try and use. Plus, they're much more into technology and things than the older generation. Well, I'm saying that I'm thinking of my teenager. I know he's into all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
And speaking of attention, I can't retain any information after reading a book or text. What can I do?
Now, this is something that's quite often reported, and particularly for younger people who are potentially still at universities, for example, or higher education, and there's a lot of stuff that they need to remember, and sometimes it's often textbook stuff that they need to remember. But even for others, reading a novel, for example, or reading a news story, this can be a bit of a challenge. So my first advice is try and make mini summaries of what you're reading. For example, after reading a chapter, see if you can remember the information that's contained in the chapter, because that helps you to process newer information in the future, in the subsequent chapters. Sometimes trying to visualize what was in the chapter might help. Some people find it helpful to tell someone else about what it is that they've just read. I bore my partner to death with things that, I've read and found really interesting, because I do want to remember this detail. And I find that conveying that information to another person, narrating that information, is a way of kind of encoding or making the strength of that memory a little more robust. So these are different ways in which you're able to encode information and strengthen the trace of that memory. So these are some of the strategies you could try.
And I guess that's going back to the teenager as well, because I remember when I was in school, this was pre my MS diagnosis, I used to read a text like history on things and then sort of retell it to one of my friends who was also studying for the same exam. And I feel like that was actually a really good way of doing it, because I can find that now that I can read a book or a chapter, and then I thought, I have no idea what happened, but so I guess I should go back to what I used to do as a teenager.
And some of those mini summaries, as you go along, are really helpful, rather than trying to read a large piece of text, for example, an entire book or an entire news story, and then trying to recall all the nitty-gritties. That makes it a bit more difficult, a bit more challenging, really.
Let's talk a little bit about MS and cognition at work. I struggle with cognition at work. How can I explain my problems to my boss in order for me to, basically not lose their job?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and sadly it happens to several people with MS. Technically, if you do declare a disability in the UK employers are expected to make reasonable adjustments for you. What is deemed reasonable can be a bit of a subjective decision. This may, for instance, mean that you're given more time to spend on some of the work that you're required to do that requires a lot of mental effort, or you're given more breaks, or so that you're not overly fatigued, which can have an impact in terms of your cognition. And some people may require a mobile phone or a recorder to make little audio notes to enable them to recall the information that they need to recall. However, the first thing to consider is whether or not to disclose that you've got MS, or that you've got specific symptoms of MS. And the other big decision is, how and when to do this, and with whom to disclose this information. There is no one size fits all over here, and it really depends on you as an individual, and it depends on your work environment. This should be completely and entirely up to you to decide. And it is a complex decision, and something that needs to be done after careful consideration of the pros and cons, because it's really important to weigh up your options carefully before making this decision, because once you've disclosed this information, it's very difficult, if impossible, to kind of take that back, because people already know about it. But some people do find it helpful to speak to their immediate line manager, while others may want to check in with their HR services or occupational health department at work. Sometimes letting colleagues know about your difficulties may make them understand your issues a bit better, and they may not judge you for not being as quick to do stuff, or compared to others, or indeed compared to yourself before your MS diagnosis. So in those instances, it does help to disclose your diagnosis, but it's really important, again, to make this decision carefully. Discuss it with others, like your MS treating team, with your family and close friends, to kind of weigh up the pros and cons. And I'd also like to signpost people to some resources. For example, the MS Trust, and I know the MS Society also have some websites that are really helpful to help you to think through some of these processes before you actually go ahead and disclose that information to people.
And I guess on the flip side of this, and if you are an employer and you have someone with MS, I guess going and getting information about MS and sort of understanding it yourself will help for you to manage your employee.
Absolutely, because the reason you've got this person working with you is because they've got fantastic skills that they can offer you and your organization. So you want to make the best use of this individual's skills, and you want to make it possible for this person to provide the expertise and the skills that they have, and their MS shouldn't stop them from being able to provide that information for you as an employer. And there is something called vocational rehabilitation. Now, vocational rehabilitation is something that's not always provided for people with MS, again, because we've got a limited amount of resources to provide vocational rehabilitation, and it's definitely not offered by all NHS MS clinics. But occupational therapists are well placed to enable people to break down their job-related problems and problem solve those issues so that people can engage better. We're doing some research around vocational rehabilitation. Vocational rehabilitation is not just for the individual with MS, but as you mentioned, for employers also, because they need to understand how best to support people with MS working in their organizations.
Here's a question from a lady who says, husband lives with progressive MS and has become really detached, emotionless, and like he's on his own world. Why is this happening? And what can she do about it?
People experience cognitive difficulties in very many different ways. So issues of cognition can sometimes be linked to issues of low mood and fatigue also. So sometimes the withdrawal may be related to the cognitive difficulties that people are facing, but it may also be related to mood difficulties. Therefore, it's important for both these aspects to be considered when meeting with the MS treating team, and they may be able to do an assessment to determine what's actually causing this withdrawal. Is it the cognitive difficulties? Is it because this individual is finding it very difficult to engage in daily activities and therefore withdrawing, or is it because they're feeling low about not being able to engage and that's why they're withdrawing? So it will be important to discuss this with the treating team so they get a better understanding of what is actually causing the problem. Because once they've got a better understanding of the cause of the problem, they may be able to refer on to either a psychologist or a neuropsychologist or an OT, an occupational therapist, to deal with the underlying cause with specific types of therapies.
Do you think for someone like that who is a partner of someone with MS, that if the person with MS might not want to talk about it, or might in some cases not even be aware that they're having sort of cognitive issues, is there any kind of tips you can give to the partner or the friends that are around to sort of raise the issue without, I guess, being too scary? Because anything to deal with things like this can be very overwhelming to talk about.
Of course, yeah, but I also think that, ignoring it is not going to be a good solution. So I think the best way to deal with it would be to raise it and say, look, I have noticed this happening. What's happening to you, or can we talk about it? Is this something you would like to talk about? I'm concerned about this. They may have their own reasons. It might be that actually, I'm really fatigued, and that's why I'm withdrawing, because I find that engaging in all this activity really tires me out. So I'm prioritizing which activity. It might be something that you haven't thought about as a carer. So try and find out what the individual's own experience of a particular problem is, and their own understanding of what's happening, and then discuss with them, okay, is this something we should probably be bringing up at the next time we meet our neurologist? Or if you're concerned, you could also speak to your GP about it. They may have some solutions.
Here's a question I feel like I could almost have written myself. I struggle so much with my concentrations. Some days I'm fine, and other days I can't follow a conversation at all. What can I do? I feel like I must be quite rude to people sometimes, because I find this doing conversations like this with Zoom is brilliant, because I only got you to focus on it. But if I'm in, say, a pub or a restaurant and there's other things going on, I really struggle with things.
Absolutely, yeah. I totally empathize, and I know it's really difficult, and many people, as you've just said yourself, share this experience. Now, if you're able to tell the person you're having this conversation with about the difficulties you're experiencing in concentrating, I think that might be helpful, because people will not perceive you as being rude, because then they're able to understand, okay, you're not being rude, there is something here, because they may be able to alter their communication style also. So I think that's a key thing, because when communication, it is a multi-pronged approach, and it's a two-way street, or multi-avenue approach. So it's not just you, it's the other person also. So try and make it easier for the other person to explain things in a way that will enable you to focus better. You don't always have to be detailed about why you're having difficulties with the concentration. Some people may simply say that they have a medical condition which makes concentration difficult. But one thing that is often helpful is to get people to repeat what they've said, and also for you to try and repeat what they've said in your own words, just to be sure that you've understood. And that enables people to actually focus their attention on what's being said, because you've got to repeat that.
That's good. So almost taking it back to the reading the text and making yourself a little mini summary that you've understood this.
Exactly.
Here's another one. I see a lot of memory apps. Can I actually train my memory to be better? This is a question we see a lot of.
Yeah, I get this a lot also. Yeah, but based on my reading of the research, to be honest, the jury's still out on this. Now, some apps claim that repeated use of this app can improve memory, but oftentimes what is tested is also what is being trained. So, for instance, there are apps that help you to remember word lists, and you may actually get better at recalling word lists, which isn't a bad thing. But the difficulty is that it doesn't necessarily translate into more complex memory issues, like, for example, remembering to pick up your daughter from school, or paying an important bill that needs to be paid. So this is what we refer to as the problem of lateral transfer. So, you may improve on a very specific thing that the app is training you to do, but unfortunately, the research done on several of these apps doesn't show that it translates or it generalizes into other types of memory issues that you may encounter in daily life.
But they won't really do any harm if you like doing them.
We don't see any harm in doing them, but if you need to weigh up the pros and the cons, for example, if you're going to have to pay for this app, then you need to think about whether it's worth the amount of money you're going to spend on a particular app. But if it's free and it's not going to cause you any distraction, then give it a go. It's not a problem.
Here's another question we see a lot of. Is there any foods that I can eat or supplements I could take to try and improve my cognition issues?
I'm afraid I'm not a dietitian, so I don't know the specifics around this. But what research has shown is that a healthy, balanced diet, reduced alcohol intake, and if you're a smoker, stopping smoking definitely helps in terms of cognition. The specifics of the diet, I'm not an expert, so I really shouldn't be advising people on specific diets, but speak to your GP, speak to a dietitian, a nutritionist. They may be able to advise on healthy diets.
Here's an interesting one. At the end of the day, I find my mind racing and I just can't get to sleep, even though I'm so tired. What can I actually do to sort of quiet my mind at the night?
This is something a lot of people experience, and not just people with MS, but people without MS also experience this. And I found that some people have a set of routines that they do just before bedtime or in the evenings that seems to enable them to rest better. For example, dimmer lights in the evening, reducing the amount of blue lights in the bedrooms, and definitely no screen time on your mobile phone, your laptops, or even television later towards the evening, and definitely in bed is helpful in helping people to wind down mentally. That seems to help. But some people also find it helpful to listen to something like a podcast to get their mind off things. Oftentimes people obsess or think about things about work or things about their personal life that they're stressing about, and then that can get them into a little bit of a mental loop that keeps them quite awake. So focusing your attention onto something that is slightly interesting. I'm not going to say terribly interesting, because that can wind you up or get you really stimulated. Also, if there's something that's really, really interesting. So find something that's somewhere middle of the ground in terms of your level of interest, and preferably something with a more soothing voice, like an audiobook or something, is something to kind of focus your mind away from something that's stressful or something that's weighing heavily on your mind. But it takes your mind away, and that might have a bit of a soporific or a calming effect that enables you to go to sleep.
That reminded me that I think a few months ago, because I use one of these audiobook things, and there was a targeted ad towards me for a book called Really Boring Bedtime Stories. And apparently that was supposed to do exactly that. So you listen to something that calms you down, but you don't get so interested that you want to listen to another chapter. You just kind of drift off.
That's always a challenge, isn't it? Finding the right podcast for you. But sometimes some people find some soothing music also helpful. Because what it does is sometimes it enables you to breathe much slower and in a more calm way that enables you to sleep a bit better also.
This is an interesting one, which I would say I actually have come across it myself, because I'm a runner and I like to do like a map planning of where I'm going. And sometimes when I'm out running, I suddenly forget how to get to a place, even though I've run there so many times. And this question is exactly that, saying sometimes I forget to get to places even though I've been there before. Is this common, and is there anything I can do about this?
Absolutely. I think it is very common, more common than people experience, because a lot of people who come to do research with us do report having this problem. So I can't tell you how common it is, but it certainly is not uncommon. There are two things that I would recommend, and one you seem to be doing already, which is to plan your trip before you go out on your run or go out for that walk. Look at a map and try and visualize your journey. If you have been on this route before, try and remember what are the things that you notice on the way. Are there any specific landmarks? And try and learn and relearn the route in smaller chunks. So if you do a 5K run, try and see, okay, what does your first K look like? What are the kind of things that you would normally expect to see in the first kilometer? And then so on and so forth. The second thing that I would do is to use a GPS system like a Maps app or on your phone or as a backup, because you don't necessarily need it. But if you do, then you could fall back on it, because sometimes what happens is that people get anxious. If they suddenly think, oh gosh, where I haven't noticed this before, where am I? And the anxiety actually makes it a lot worse, because then you're unable to concentrate and focus on your route. Sometimes going a little further, not too far, but a little further, suddenly brings into sharp focus a memory or a landmark that you notice, and then you say, okay, now I know where I am, and then you can continue. But I wouldn't advise going much further, because you could be lost, in which case go back, fall back onto your GPS, onto your mobile phone or your tracker, and then figure out where you are. But two things done in parallel really helps, the planning aspect of it, figuring out where it is that you need to go, particularly if you're driving. Look through a maps app, whatever, figure out where it is you need to get to, what you expect to see, and then have a backup also.
I think for myself, when I've been doing the running, it can also be if I'm being quite fatigued. So I've sort of realized then that maybe this is the time to stop now and sort of walk instead, or do something, because I think my body and mind is sort of just so fatigued that I'm getting confused.
Absolutely, and you know what you've really hit the nail on the head over here. Cognition is really complex. There are various things that can help or hinder your ability to stay focused or on track or remember things. And fatigue is definitely one of those things. So, if you're feeling particularly fatigued and you're required to do something that requires a lot of mental effort, and if there's a possibility of postponing that activity to when you're potentially feeling less fatigued, then I would definitely advocate for that. So some people tell us that actually I feel a lot more fatigued in the afternoons, but I'm more mentally alert in the mornings. So I would suggest, if it's possible, to adjust your workday in such a way that the kind of more cognitively demanding tasks are done in the morning when you're less fatigued, and do kind of more mundane or routine tasks that don't require as much cognitive activity to do those tasks at times where you feel a bit more fatigued. The same with mood. If you're feeling, if you're experiencing low mood, that's going to have an impact in your cognitive ability and your ability to feel confident to be able to undertake a particular task, because that's also a major aspect in relation to how you feel you're able to perform in relation to cognition.
And that's interesting what we're talking about with work as well, because if you have a line manager or an HR department that you feel you can talk to, telling them things like this clearly will help as well, if you can adjust what you're actually doing at work and at what times, because then that will hopefully make you be able to stay and work for longer as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Going back to exercise, actually, I find my cog fog, I do love the word cog fog, my cog fog lifts when I go for a walk or a run. Does exercise actually help?
Yep, absolutely. There's a lot of research now to show that staying active does help. Some people may not be able to do as much as they used to do before because of mobility issues or issues related to spasticity or, as you mentioned, fatigue. But there are always ways in which exercises can be adapted or modified to suit your level of ability. If possible, speak to a physiotherapist. They may be able to advise in terms of what kind of activities that you may be able to engage safely, and that's going to be beneficial for you. But sometimes I notice that even some leisure centers and personal trainers in gyms nowadays are becoming more aware of not necessarily having people with MS as their clients, but people with other types of disabilities that also make it difficult for them to engage in exercise. So speaking to them, they will be able to give you some advice in terms of modifying some of the exercises that you can do that can be fun also for you to do. But there is good evidence to show that having a good diet and good exercise is also related to better cognition and cognitive health.
I think I go to Zumba, and when my brain is really, really tired, I struggle with like following the moves. But I also find that that's one of those things we were talking about, memory training and apps and things like that, that actually trying to remember certain steps in certain orders actually does push me out of my comfort zone a little bit. And then the next week when I go, I do remember what I was supposed to do. So I don't know if that's memory training or not, but I find it beneficial. Here's an interesting one, and the last question that we had sent in to us. I sometimes have deja vu episodes. Can I blame this on my MS?
You could blame it on your MS if it helps, but I'm afraid I don't know any research that actually makes that link evident.
I haven't heard that one before, but I think, isn't that also a problem that we are blaming an awful lot on our MS, and sometimes it actually might be something completely different?
Yeah, it could be completely different. It could be, one of the things that we also need to remember is, we're all growing older, and as we grow older, there are some natural aging processes that relate to your ability to pay attention as well as you did when you were younger, or your ability to recall information as well as you did when you were younger. So sometimes you're absolutely right, there are natural aging processes or things unrelated to MS that we shouldn't be getting too worried about, thinking, is this my MS now? So there are things that happen to people with MS and without MS. That's part of the natural aging process, also in relation to cognition.
Right. So if we should be doing a little bit of a recap of our conversation now, as that would be a good memory training, what would you say would be the sort of the main takeaway from this as regard to if you are somebody who's living with cognition issues?
Well, I think some of the key take-home messages are a healthy diet, taking some exercise, trying to lead as less stressful a life as you possibly can, and identifying the cognitive problems as and when they come up, and figuring out what causes or when these cognitive problems emerge, so that you can make some changes in your daily life to enable you to function as well as you can function, given some of the limitations that you may have related to cognitive symptoms or other symptoms related to MS, and definitely try using any kind of aids that's going to make your life a lot easier.
Fantastic. And talk about it. Go to your MS team or your partners and your work colleagues.
Talk about it to people you trust and people you need to talk about who may be able to help you further.
Thank you so much for chatting to me today.
Thank you very much.
Right, and we're back. What did you make of Roshan? It was very interesting, all the stuff he was saying.
Yeah, it was interesting. There were so many things in there that, I knew it was a complex topic, but I don't think I realised just how complex. And I think one of the takeaways for me is what he said quite early on in the interview, which was that, the causes of cognition problems in MS aren't always necessarily to do with the nerve pathways being damaged. It's also to do with the fact that you're living with the burden of other MS symptoms. And then also perhaps you're living with, the effects of medication too. So I think I thought about the medication side, but I hadn't really thought about the other MS symptoms. Obviously fatigue does affect it, but I guess there is that additional burden that you're carrying all the time, or that we're carrying all the time when we've got MS with the different symptoms. So yeah, that totally makes sense on days when I'm personally having physical symptoms, parts of my body that I just then, I guess I get weary, get tired with them, it wears you down. So then the cognition is affected too. So that was interesting. What about you?
I'm the same. I find it really interesting. In the summer when we had that super duper hot a few days when it was 38 or whatever it was degrees, I just remember sitting there going like, I was completely stuck. I could not stand up, and I don't really have mobility problems, but it was like my brain was just like not knowing how to communicate with my legs to actually kind of rise up, because I went into to to my bedroom to pick up some socks, I think it was, or putting them away. And I completely lost track of what I was doing. And I just remember sitting there. My husband came in and was like, what are you doing? And I went, I'm stuck. And he was like, oh, do I need to lift you up? And I was like, no, I'm like mentally stuck, not physically stuck. And it's really hard sometimes to explain cognition issues.
It is, yeah. That's a good way of describing it, stuck as well. So I think it's a bit like, I kind of assimilate it to like getting the wrong gear in a car. You know, if you're trying to drive and you're trying to get into you're driving a manual car and you're trying to put it into gear, it's that feeling that when the gears crunch or you don't quite connect with the right gear, it's like you sometimes literally just are in neutral and you cannot think of what you want to do next, what you were doing while you got there, and what came before. It's just you literally just have this kind of almost like freezing moment. And yeah, it's true. The other thing I thought he said that was interesting as well was about the vocational rehabilitation. So I'd never heard about any of that before. That was news to me, which was really interesting, and definitely something worth exploring, I guess.
I think so, because I feel like, you know, like I said in the beginning of this, when we chatted about actually raising it with my manager, that I needed to be away from too much noise and things like that. It's quite a simple solution for something that might, you know, some people might really struggle with. And there's so many people that leave work because of cognition issues. I think first when I was diagnosed with MS, I would have thought that people took, you know, ill retirement for maybe more like mobility type issues. But like reading the stats, cognition is, you know, very, very, very high up on the list. And if there are little strategies and things like that, and people would actually work, you know, the thing that I find very interesting with some of these like rehabilitations things is that you can maybe even get your management. See, I'm losing words again. Get your management in on it. So if your manager was willing to do it, like come with them to the appointment and sort of talk about how can we solve this in a good way. When I was diagnosed, actually, the company that I work for there was like a quite big American company, and I came in and I said I've been diagnosed to my manager, and he was like, oh, I'm going to let HR know. And then they called up straight away, and this woman, she was like, what can we do for you? And I really didn't know then, you know, because I was like, I've just been diagnosed, I don't even know what's going on. But I did sort of, after a while, I said, let me get back to you. And I sort of asked her, would it be possible for me to work from home for a few days? Because I feel like I could probably concentrate more then. And they were fine with it, you know, and this was many, many years before home working was the done deal. So I feel like it's sometimes, though, it's good to voice your concern and sort of say that, well, and offer some solutions. And I think that's the nice thing with this. Instead of just saying, well, this is a problem, then actually maybe kind of go, well, this is a problem, but I think this could potentially be a solution. So could we try that? But I mean, it all depends on if you've got a management team that's willing to listen.
It does. That's true. That's a big part of it, isn't it, really? Yeah. Hopefully things are changing in a more positive direction. I would say the pandemic's helped with that, hasn't it? It's kind of shone a light on all the different reasons people have for working from home, and makes probably having that conversation now a little bit easier for people with MS to begin with.
I think one of the things that Roshan was talking about as well, when we were talking about things like, you know, repeating, that really was a kind of aha moment for me, because I thought, you know, that's what I used to do with my school books. I would read a chapter on history, I would put it down, and then I try to remember how much as possible that I've seen there. And I feel like that's something that after talking to him, I've actually been doing that much more, especially if there's stuff. So we got some kind of plumbing issues at the moment, and my husband been telling me all these different things that, well, this plumber says this and this plumber says that, and what should we do? So I sort of, in order to not to drift away, because it's maybe not the most interesting subject, I kind of really go, okay, so he said this, he said that, and actually try to put that into practice. And it does help, because I do remember now what we need to do. It's not fun because it's expensive, but I do remember, and I remember what the different costs were as well, because I did. So I do feel like that there's a lot of sort of small little techniques there that you can try.
Definitely, that's one that I think I'll take away from it as well. Yes, I think we were saying earlier on that one of the things I struggle with sometimes, some days I can retain loads of information, I can take in lots of complex information, and I can actually almost be hungry for more. It's kind of like, okay, you've told me that, tell me more. And then other days it's just all I need is top line. And a really good example is like my husband, he works in software, and I'll say to him sometimes casually, how was your day, you know, and expect him just to sort of say, yeah, it was good, it was bad, or whatever, and he'll go into a massive amount of detail about things I don't understand. You know, it's a completely different alien world for me anyway at the best of times. And I sometimes I'm talking to him, I'm nodding and agreeing and thinking, can he actually see that there's a glaze gone over because none of it's gone in? And I think I probably need to be better on those days about saying to him, just give me top line, just tell me the top line things that I need to know. I don't need to know the detail, or doing what you've just said there, asking him to repeat certain things as well. And I think sometimes in conversations with people, when I'm not having a great day, I need to take control a bit more by perhaps telling people up front, look, I'm not having a great day today in terms of cognition. I might not absorb things as well, or I might need you to repeat them. And perhaps there's no shame in actually saying that, because it's, as Roshan said in the interview, you're kind of giving the other person an insight into the two-way aspect of conversation. It goes both ways. The communication goes both ways. So perhaps, we need to be a bit more responsible and a bit more, take control of ourselves a little bit more. See, I'm struggling here just trying to describe what I'm saying. I kind of knew this was going to happen. I thought two people with MS talking about cognition. At some point, we were going to lose the thread.
We will. I think it's very interesting that I feel like I've become a bit better at actually sort of voicing my concern. I think, with my husband and my kids, they sometimes they're a bunch of sarcastic people, and they like to take the biscuit sometimes, but I do sometimes have to sort of say, look, I am struggling now, can we please slow it down a little bit and just people one speak at a time, because I can't follow. It's just but sometimes when I lose words, like I said before, I try to describe the thing, but then if I can't find it as well, I just need them not to try and put the word in my mouth as it was as well, because I do feel like that's something that I've learned myself when I'm talking to not just necessarily people with MS, but if you can see somebody's really struggling with trying to find a word, you don't want to just jump in there and try and save the day until they actually ask for it. It's unsolicited advice in some ways, but it's because the frustration if somebody's oh, you're trying to say this or this or this or this or this, and it's no.
Yeah,
just
absolutely. Yeah, and when that happens, I think we were saying as well, someone does try and fill a word for you and it isn't the right word, then that can send your brain off down a different path, and you then completely lose the thread of what you were saying, as well as it making you feel a bit inadequate because you weren't able to complete the sentence yourself. I find that massively frustrating.
It's all fun and games, isn't it, once it starts, but I mean, that is why it's so nice to talk to other people with MS as well, because sometimes you just kind of go, okay, well, let's just let's forget that conversation, let's move on to something else, because we both know that this isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually did post on the MS Trust Facebook group to see if there were any tips from the community as well, because sometimes you get some fantastic things. I think it was very unanimous that people love writing lists. Are you a list maker?
I am. The only problem with that sometimes is I sometimes forget that I've written it down. I used to say I'd lose the list because I was constantly trying to tidy things away, but sometimes I find I write something down and then I forget I've written it down, and then I write it down again, and then later on I find that I've got a list started in 3 different parts of the house with the same thing on it. So that's something, but maybe that's partly to do with age as well. It might not just be to do with with MS Cogfog.
I find if I'm doing things like that, I need to see stuff in front of me. My husband is always finding me, I'm quite a messy person, but I'm if I can't see the thing that I need doing, if it's tidied away, I'll forget doing it. So if I know, for instance, that I need to fill in, I don't know, say a form or something, I have to put the form in the kitchen so I know I see it every time I walk past, and then I will fill it in. But if it's tidied away in a pile, then it's gone. Yeah, no,
I'm exactly the same with that. I can literally only see the things that are in front of me. Last week, actually, I did a kind of quite a scary thing happened. I was cooking in the kitchen. I'd put the pan on the stove, put some oil in it. So I was making burgers, and then I don't know why I wasn't looking at the pan, and then there was something on the worktop that I knew needed to go upstairs. I took it upstairs, put it on the bed, and then while I was up there, I then did something else, and I did another thing, and before I knew it, I could smell this kind of burning sensation. I came downstairs, and the smoke alarm didn't go off, but there was a very hot pan of oil on the stove that I'd forgotten was there. That kind of scared me a little bit and made me really think that that's when it starts to become potentially a little bit dangerous. I'm with you on that. I've become more aware that what I see in front of me is what I've got to focus on, and I've got to be aware about how I manage that, I think.
Yeah, I feel like there's a meme where they're saying like my brain is like 5 million browser windows open, and where is that sound coming from? And I think it is very much like that. And when you are tired, because I've done the same when I've sort of I took something off the hob and then left the hob on. My husband was like, "Are you finished with the hob?" And I was going, "Oh, yeah, sorry," because I'd gone off to do something else. And I feel like, especially when you're a parent and you're working and you're doing all these things, it's like so much stuff that's going on at once, but sometimes you just need to finish one job at a time rather than try and do everything at once.
And I think it's just being aware that you've got to sometimes take a step back and accept that you can't multitask things as well as maybe you would like to, or maybe even that you used to be able to do, because if you try and do it and it doesn't work, then there can become serious consequences for that too.
Yeah, and actually ask for some help as well. It's like, even if you feel like, oh, I have to have someone help me with this, it's better, because if the job gets done and it's well done, then it's better even if you kind of do a half attempt at doing it, because something goes a little bit wrong. So sometimes I have to sort of, I don't know, swallow my pride a little bit and go, excuse me, I need some help here.
Yeah, I'm learning to do that more as well. I think there's always been a tendency for me to think, okay, so because I've got MS, I need to prove even more that I can do everything and I can do it really well. I don't want to be seen as being a victim or suffering with it. I hate that word, suffering. So I will go to the nth degree to kind of make sure that I can cover it all. But I think you're right. I think there does come a point where you have to say, actually, I'm only a human being at the end of the day, and we're all human, and we all, we can't all do everything all the time.
Yeah, no, I'm exactly with you on that one. Let's ask for help more.
Definitely. Remember, the MS Trust is here for you if you have any questions about MS, whether they're related to memory issues or not. You can contact the MS Trust Inquiry Service between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m, Monday to Friday, except for UK bank holidays. And if you have any questions about life with MS, they're there for you. They're available on 0800 032 3839, or you can email at ask@mstrust.org.uk, and someone will get back to you as soon as possible.
You can also find the MS Trust on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can find this podcast on Spotify, Google and Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music. And I'm sure at other places where you normally get your podcasts from as well. Get in touch, and like they say, like and subscribe, share this podcast. Help us spread our mumbled, confused words about cognition. Let us know what you find, tricky about cognition.
I'm doing it for you there.
And if you found any tips and tricks that might be working for you. One of the future podcasts that we're going to be doing for next year is going to be about altered sensations. Are you struggling with any altered sensations, Debs?
Actually, I am at the moment, and I have been since about Wednesday last week. So I've got this constant sort of it feels like I've got a mobile phone in my foot, basically. So I feel like there's a constant mobile phone buzzing. It's buzz, buzz, buzz. It's just there all the time at the moment. It's not so bad when I'm walking or I'm at the gym doing something physical. It kind of seems to drown it out. But if I'm sitting at night time, even just sitting now, as I've got my legs crossed, I can feel it in my foot. It's just constantly there. So I'll be looking forward to listening to that one.
Yeah, those type of feelings are really, really annoying. I mean, sometimes they can actually be painful, but a lot of the times I find that it's just something like that, where it's like, a buzzing or a fizzing or a
It is,
tingling.
And that affects your cognition too, doesn't it? That actually impacts on your cognition because you're constantly aware of it in the background. It's like another one of those browser tabs that you've got open that you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have anything to say about this topic, we would love to hear from you. And what we really, really would love to hear from you about is how you deal with it. We've heard some fantastic techniques in the past about like people dealing with the MS hug by maybe like tying something around them so it feels like something is actually squeezing them, or wearing a hat if something feels like it's squeezing your, all those tips. I'd love to hear more of them, because I feel like this is going to be a life hack episode, I think. So if you want to send in your tips or questions, it can be totally anonymous. You can do it on a voice note or a message via WhatsApp on 0745830336, or alternatively you can email mystory@mstrust.org.uk. Now, I would like to say, before I say thank you to Anne Chapman for making the music, I would like to say a big thank you to Debs for doing these podcasts with me as well. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure for me as well.
I guess I go back then and say thank you. Now Anne's got to thank you twice, but thank you, Anne Chapman, for making the music. And looking forward to seeing you all for the next podcast. Bye.
Bye.